All right. What a pleasure to be here with all of you. I've been here the whole day, and I'm really amazed by all the fantastic perspectives that we've been listening to. And I can promise you that you're going to hear some even more incredible stories right now. We have four incredible speakers coming up now with perspectives from all over the world. And so I'd love you to give a warm welcome to these four incredible individuals who will inspire you and maybe give you some new perspectives as well. Welcome to the stage. And I'll introduce them as we go along with the opening questions. Rebecca, you are the Vice President of the Wikimedia Foundation, and you have a long and distinguished career working in this field. The foundation hosts Wikipedia, and you have a host of volunteers curating the Wikipedia sites, but also many other sites that are gathering knowledge freely globally. And today we've been discussing disinformation and misinformation. And for those watching digitally, have already heard Rebecca define this term. But for those in the audience, I thought it could be maybe helpful if you could start with what is your definition of misinformation and disinformation in this context?
Sure. Well, thanks so much for having all of us on stage today. So misinformation, as some panelists have discussed earlier, is information that is false, but is not spread intentionally to deceive. It might be your aunt sending around something they saw that excited them and doesn't realize that it's false. Disinformation is false information that is spread intentionally with a specific agenda. And what we find at the Wikimedia Foundation is that disinformation is often accompanied by threats against people who try to counter the disinformation campaigns against the people trying to debunk the disinformation, et cetera. So it's quite dangerous, literally and physically.
Yeah, I think we're going to hear a bit more about that in the panel as well. I mean, people here are amazing individuals who've experienced firsthand the price that you can pay for telling the truth in a landscape filled with misinformation and disinformation. And earlier today, we heard a lot about the pandemic and the Wikimedia Foundation, but in particular, the volunteers who run Wikipedia were in the middle of this battle. Could you describe to us how that played out during the pandemic?
Sure. Well, since the start of the pandemic, volunteer editors of Wikipedia and other related projects have been at the front lines of countering misinformation and disinformation on the projects. And just because anybody can become an editor of Wikipedia doesn't mean there aren't rules about what you can and cannot do. And the rules and the system for enforcing the rules is created by the volunteers themselves. And those rules relate to what is considered neutral, well-sourced content, and the people developing those rules and enforcing the rules include experts, people with local knowledge, et cetera. And so how that played out in the pandemic, take, for example, one of our heroes, Dr. Neta Hussain, who's a clinical neuroscientist from Kerala, India, but living in Germany. She started something called Wiki Project Medicine, bringing together dozens and dozens of experts, scientists, doctors, to focus on COVID-19 related information and making sure it was well-sourced, monitoring those pages. And so now there are around 7,000 Wikipedia articles related to COVID-19 in over 230 languages, according to my colleagues. And so again, there's COVID-19 related factual information in some languages where it's very hard to get any other information. And what's more, there's also a cohort of volunteers who've been documenting the disinformation and misinformation about COVID-19. And so you can go on to Wikipedia and check what the disinformation is. You can also click on the history tab and the talk tab to see all the edits that have made and all the debates about what is and isn't factual on every page.
Yeah, oh, that's really impressive. And I think in a landscape where information is getting more and more how to say, spread, right? It's really important to have some trusted sources of information that is also freely available, which is also becoming maybe a challenge. So I'm going to get back to you a little bit on this issue, but I want to now move to Maia. You founded the Alliance for Europe, and you're working for a more democratic Europe by fighting disinformation through community building, digital intelligence, and campaigns. You're now based in Warsaw, Poland, but you also do a lot of work on the border of Ukraine. And as a result, you're also witnessing the horrors and consequences of the invasion by Russia into Ukraine. And I think it could be interesting for the audience to hear how misinformation and disinformation is a part of that war and that conflict.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be in here because like the topic of disinformation and disinformation in particular is really changing our behaviors. It's changing the way how we think, but it's also basically building our future. So it's on us what choices you will make in order to kind of get the information. But listening to all the previous panelists, especially the scientists, thinking what Russia is doing and other bad actors is basically putting the science at work. And we're thinking of how to do that, but they are already doing it. The weaponizing of information and disinformation is huge. And we are seeing that in Poland. And what Melissa Fleming has said a year ago, I've been going to Ukraine, and I've been really very much touch-hearted, like hearted touch with all of my citizens from Poland as well, supporting the refugees from Ukraine. But what we've been seeing for the past year, it was a spread of disinformation and misinformation on trying to polarize our both societies. And it's not only happening in Poland, it's happening pretty much everywhere. So Russia and also other bad actors that are using disinformation, they are working on our cultural biases, but very much working on our brain and the way how our brain is working, right? So we are in fear pretty much for the past few years since the pandemic, right? We first fear for our lives because of COVID-19. And then in Europe, we fear of the war. And when we fear, our brains are closing. We are having the fight, flight, or freeze response. And that's when we are having the tunnel thinking. And if we're looking at the information space, if it's floated by disinformation, and disinformation is very often working on fear, that's where we are coming. And what we are trying to do with Alliance for Europe is to take the whole society approach. Exactly on one of the regions in the border in Poland, we are working with Partnership Hub, working with 10 different organizations on the ground, with the municipalities, and doing a research to see those changes in the attitudes and thinking of how we can respond, because positive communication and strategic communication is the way to move forward. And the social media, we have a war a bit, and whether we're gonna know how to communicate our values, or we're just gonna be looking at how disinformation is being spread is a question that's gonna build our future and our common future.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think you touched on also, a topic that's been a theme as well today. In between, I mean, the reward systems in social media. Tristan Harris was also discussing the effects of certain business models of big tech actors, and that sort of brings me to the next person on the panel, which is Flora, and she's working for the non-profit, and you're a champion of social justice issues and disinformation in particular. And you have witnessed really firsthand how systemic misinformation and disinformation can be a threat to democracy. I think this has been already quite clear today, but I'd love for you to tell us briefly how this has played out in Brazil, where there recently was an election, and considering we're in Washington, D.C., there was also something that looked very much like a resurrection and invasion of your state capital.
Yes, first of all, great to be here. Thank you, everyone, for having me. Yeah, so in Brazil, what we could see, unfortunately, was nothing new in terms of tactics. You have, in one side, bad actors, including officials, elected officials, people trying re-election, people trying to get elected, and bad actors in general, as Maia was saying, boosting disinformation and hate speech content, including calls for violence, including calls for a military intervention in Brazil. So you have that cohort of actors. Unfortunately, on the other hand, you also had the big tech platforms monetizing on this kind of content. So you had, in one hand, the platforms boosting and actually recommending this kind of content for users, and also allowing online ads with this kind of content. And I'm not just saying this because I think. When we conduct researches and investigative research, which we conducted for quite a long period of time following the elections in Brazil, we could see the experience of the regular user. You would go to a search bar and you look for electronic ballots. The recommendation firsthand on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube would be rigged. Instead of electronic ballots are safe or trustworthy, they would just recommend something that would lead you into a rabbit hole of disinformation. So we had that situation happening. Authorities obviously tried to step up to the limit that they could within our laws. But that led ultimately to the attacks January 8th, this year in Brazil, which was a copy and paste of what happened. And after the US 2020 elections in Capitol Hill, we had tens of thousands of people marching into Brasilia, which is Brazil's capital, literally invading official buildings, trashing everything, because deep down, they believed that the elections were rigged. And the reasons why they believed that was because for years, they've been receiving this message that the elections were going to be rigged and etc. And so, fortunately, there's a silver lining, right? We now have a new government that is looking very much eager to regulate the platforms. And so we're now seeing a great commitment from the government and also civil society at the front lines, battling to pass a legislation that is robust and will regulate the industry as a whole, including disinformation.
Yeah, thank you. And I think it's interesting. We'll probably maybe get back to that as well. I mean, earlier today, we were discussing how misinformation is, a deep societal issue. It also connects to cultural perceptions, but also injustices over time, right? And I'd love to hear afterwards maybe how that, social media, in your view, then were fueling on those sort of division lines that maybe were already there. But I'm going to move to you, Rana. You're now a world-renowned journalist. And when I was reading about Rana, I just was amazed by the things that you've been doing. I mean, she's been the longest undercover journalist in the world. Yeah. Working 8 months undercover with, I think, was it 8 cameras on your body the full time, exposing systematic religious state-fueled persecution. If it's my summary, you can tell it better than me.
We have very little time for that, though.
Yeah. And you're also yourself the subject of massive disinformation campaigns, attempts to silence you in court, death threats, and much, much more. So I want to ask you, this is a twofold question, and we'll get back to a little bit how this impacts you as a person. But could you tell us a little bit, what's the state of play on misinformation and disinformation in the world's largest democracy? India has 1.4 billion inhabitants, people. And what is the media landscape like?
The media landscape does not exist in a country of 1.4 billion people. The mainstream media is literally captured by the state. We had an independent news channel which recently saw a hostile takeover. Before I begin, I need to acknowledge the fact that 2 years ago we had a Nobel Foundation event, a Nobel Prize event. The fact that the Nobel Committee gave the Nobel Peace Prize to 2 journalists 2 years ago, decades after decades, was to acknowledge that journalists are the new enemies of the state. And how do they become enemies of the state? When you discredit them with disinformation and misinformation. I mean, when I Google myself, the first thing that I see is disinformation. I see news and stories about me much later. I come from the world's largest democracy, and I take great pride in being an Indian, but not the government that is ruling it. We're talking about misinformation and disinformation. I'll give you an example. The deputy leader of the Nobel Committee was in India 2 months ago, Mr. Asle Toje, and there was a rumor that he said, which he didn't, that Narendra Modi, the Indian Prime Minister, was the front runner for the Nobel Peace Prize. He never said that. He never said that. But that story was on the front, was the headline of every news channel in India. The spokesperson of the ruling party, everybody said that. By the time his statement came up somewhere later, I did not say that. Nobody played that. By the time that news was busted, the fact that Narendra Modi is a front runner for the Nobel Peace Prize became the actual reality. It doesn't stop at that. The Indian Prime Minister, of course, will be in the US on a state visit hosted by President Biden, who we're also told he'll be going to Camp David. But he has been promoting and endorsing a film in India which is based on the premise of Islamophobia and fake news. And one of his ministers said that people who do not watch this film are terrorist and ISIS supporters. So that's the landscape we are talking about. In absence of an independent mainstream media, some of us who are doing our journalism are made enemies of the state. Hence, we are facing what we are facing. Persecution, my bank accounts are frozen, money laundering, tax evasion, name the charges there. Sedition, criminal conspiracy, defamation. I'm just facing a charge for an article I wrote 15 years ago. God knows I don't even remember that article. But I am facing charge for it because apparently I have heard the sentiments of the majority community. That is the news story. And how does it fuel? It fuels because how do you make me an enemy of the state? When you start fueling every story about me. For instance, there's this screenshot about me that says, I hate India and I hate Indians. God knows where it came from. But every second time I tweet something, that screenshot comes up and it's circulated all over the country. Right? There is a screenshot that says, I support child rapists in the name of Islam. I have never said that, but that screenshot is there all over the internet. That's how you discredit me, saying, oh, she is a Muslim, a marginalized, a critic of the government, and her only job is to defame India on an international level. That's the role disinformation is playing in a country which we call the world's largest democracy.
Yeah. It's, yeah. We'll get back a little bit to you, Rana, and how this is sort of, how you deal with this. And I think Maria Ressa, who's also in the audience, who's going to have the closing remarks later, has been subject to many of the same tactics and can probably also attest to how this is like a very systematic approach that is used to try to silence free journalism and free speech and also individual activists. But this section of the program is also about hope, right?
Where is it?
So we have this section now where we've had a pre-meeting. So we have agreed we're going to try to end also on a hopeful note. So I'm going to challenge the panel now to two questions. I'm going to try to divide up very quickly on what can we do at the systematic level, and then what can we do at the individual level. I think we'll start with the systematic level. And Rebecca, we'll start with you and go this way.
Sure. Well, it's pretty clear that independent journalists, open and independent science, independent research, open data repositories, libraries, Wikipedia are the world's best antidote to mis- and disinformation. That means you need to protect and support the people who are contributing, who are reporting facts, who are sharing facts, who are working to verify facts. Right now, our laws and regulations are not prioritizing that. There's all kinds of debates about how do we regulate internet platforms, how do we hold technology accountable. Don't forget, Wikipedia is an internet platform, different business model, but the point is that there's so much discussion about how you punish the bad guys. Let's not, just because you see a cockroach in the kitchen, you blowtorch the whole kitchen, right? So let's make sure that when we're addressing harms, we're not actually making vulnerable independent journalists, independent researchers and scientists who are under threat, who we heard about earlier before this panel, making it even harder for them to do their work without being sued, without being threatened, without being surveilled, without being exposed and doxxed. Make sure the law isn't making it worse for them while you're trying to go after genuine harms. And that is the biggest problem we're seeing today. And Wikipedia is facing this all the time, where everybody wants to punish big tech with their laws, but they're sort of catching Wikipedia up in the net, and many proposed laws will actually make it much harder for people to edit Wikipedia without going to jail, being surveilled, or being sued. And so this is something that people need to keep in mind.
Yeah, no, I think it's such a complicated issue, right? And there's no quick fix here. I think that's really clear from this summit today, that there's really no quick fix. But there are some proposals on the table. And Maia, you've been working on several policy initiatives in the European Union. Could you tell us a little bit about, if you could say one or two things that you think would really help on this issue?
Definitely, I believe that regulation helps, and it needs to be a smart regulation and ethical regulation, because what we really need more ethics and values in our internet. And being afraid of AI, it's not something that's going to bring us a future. It's a good technology. Internet is good. Strategic communication is good. We just need to use it, but use it in a way that bad actors also won't win, right? So coming all together in a room is usually the best thing to do. And I'm very grateful that tomorrow that's what we're going to do in here. We're going to meet as the group of experts and try to arrange the future. But I also want to say that not only regulations are good. What is important, I would like to see the media literacy education, critical thinking education, and also one that is the most important for me, emotional intelligence education in every single school. Because when we talk about disinformation and how it affects us, it's, as I said, usually something that we fear. And each of us feel the fear. And when we fear that, when we feel the fear, it's the moment to come back to yourself. And that's something that we should be learning humanity from the very single beginning, from being kid. Emotions are the normal things that is out there. So let's also remember about education.
Yeah, I think we've learned today that it's a systemic issue, but also we could do work at the individual level. Flora, you've been working both in Brazil and in the European Union on these issues. So what would be your key asks to sort of regulate or improve the situation?
I have 3.
Yeah, that's fine.
So yes to regulation. Time is over. Time is up for self-regulation of this industry. We don't want to see more Capitol Hills. We don't want to see more Brazilians. We don't want to see more Rohingyas genocides being fueled by algorithms that prime disinformation and hate speech and violence. So regulation, national level, international level, this is a global panel, this is a global forum, this is how we're supposed to tackle this issue. So regulation for sure, disinformation is a symptom, grave, a serious one, but we need to regulate the industry as a whole. So European Union just passed a regulation that we can now, look at and get inspired by, which is the Digital Services Act. The second branch of this, as Maya mentioned, is digital public policies for digital literacy. It's vital. We need to empower people to navigate the new technologies. We need to empower people to understand how to distinguish as much as possible disinformation from the true facts. And obviously, the third pillar is independent press. We as a society need to figure out how to solve this issue. It's what's happened to Rana, what's happened to Resas. There are thousands around the world being killed for speaking their truth, and this is unacceptable. And the best medicine and antidote for disinformation is accurate information. So we really need to make sure that press is free, is independent, is autonomous, and we need to make sure that our societies make possible for journalism to flourish and not perish. And if I may add a fourth, just, platforms and industries, they don't have to, be on the cross arms around the corner or just, plotting aggressive lobby tactics to stop legislation. But they can, for example, respect our laws would be a start, would be really cool. Second of all, treat citizens equally everywhere. We're not seeing that happening. English-speaking countries, the global north is taking majority of the safety and risk budget of these platforms. And third is the same level that they invest on development and news business, why don't they invest in ethics and security policies and professionals as well? Now we are seeing companies firing entire departments of ethics. So I'm done.
Yeah. No. Yeah. As you realize, these people have so much knowledge and working on this full time, so we could go on all day. But I'd love to give the last word to Rana, because you're the things you're going through, the things you're doing, I think it's inspiration to all of us. And if your story can serve as an inspiration to all of us to do something after this summit, whether you're here in this audience or you're watching this, Rana, how have you managed just to still work on this and still go back to India and report on the things you see?
I mean, the only way for us to kind of tide over this is to keep speaking up. The reason why they use disinformation and misinformation is to silence us. That if I go silent, then they win. And I do not have the luxury of being silent right now, nor do any of us who are fighting for independent journalism, civil liberties, human rights. At this point of time, the world is witnessing a right-wing churn everywhere. We have Modi, we just saw Bolsonaro, we have the prospect of Trump, we have Erdogan. We have all these leaders globally, and the only antidote to right-wing politics all over the world is independent journalists, is a platform, is ethical news. You said, how do I go on? Honestly, in an ideal world, I would just sit back and just retire. I don't have that luxury because it's been a long and relentless ride. Just facing the kind of attack that I face from the government. I do more court cases than I do my reporting of late. It's exhausting. It takes a toll on your mental health. You get anxiety attacks on flights. But that's exactly what these dictators and demagogues want. They want to tire you down. How do they tire you down? By misinformation and fake news. The only antidote to everything that we're all witnessing here is to start consuming ethical news, is to start supporting independent journalists who are risking everything, who are risking their personal lives to tell you the stories that they're telling. So please support them. This is not the time to be silent, because I believe when history is being written, history will not just record the tyrants, history will also record the silence of the well-meaning. We don't want to go down that road. So thank you so much.
Give them all a big applause. Thank you. Okay.